It was a typical evening in Austin, Texas. One of those warm, humid nights when the air feels thick with the weight of a day spent in the sun. Sophia Reynolds had just finished her work at the downtown gallery where she'd spent hours curating an exhibition that had been far more draining than she expected. Her mind was tired, her body even more so, and all she wanted now was the peace of her home and a quiet dinner with her husband, Governor Mark Reynolds. She'd taken the long route back, choosing the winding roads that led her through the outskirts of the city. There, far from the bustle of urban life, she could unwind, listening to the hum of the tires on the road, the soft click of the turn signal, and the rhythm of her own breathing. But tonight was different. The road she had chosen passed right by a fire station, one that she'd seen dozens of times before but had never given much thought to. It wasn't an area she frequented often. Yet as she turned the corner and approached the station, something about the scene before her felt off. The station was quieter than usual, the lights dimming in the shadows of the streetlights, casting long, harsh reflections on the pavement. The few firefighters standing outside seemed too eager, too boisterous. And as she drove by, their laughter cut through the quiet like an intrusive sound that didn't belong. Sophia's instincts kicked in. She was a woman who had spent years learning how to assess the moods of rooms, the feelings of people, how to sense when a situation was slipping from normalcy into something more dangerous. She could feel it now, like a knot tightening in her stomach. And she instinctively glanced in her rearview mirror. But by the time she looked back, the situation had escalated. Out of nowhere, a group of firefighters, 4 men in total, moved into her path. She was still in her car, slowing down as the road ahead narrowed. They were blocking her, leering at her through the windshield. At first, she tried to remain calm, assuming they would move out of the way, but their movements were deliberate. One of them raised a hand, motioning for her to stop. "Hey there, pretty lady," one of them shouted, his voice far too loud for the setting, carrying an edge of mockery. "We could use some help here, don't you think? You know, a woman like you might find a nice rescue mission here with us." The words were harsh, a sharp sting against her senses. But worse was the look in their eyes, a glint of arrogance and superiority that felt like a slap in the face. This wasn't a situation she could brush off. She needed to stay composed, to act calmly, to avoid escalating things further. But they didn't stop. They came closer, surrounding her car, their movements no longer playful but predatory. They began making lewd comments, laughing among themselves as if she wasn't even there, as if her presence existed solely for their amusement. "You know, a woman like you shouldn't be out here alone," another one sneered, stepping closer to the driver's side window. "You don't know what could happen. But don't worry. We're here to protect you." Sophia's heart raced. But she refused to let fear take hold. Instead, she rolled her window down, just enough to address them without fully giving in to their space. Her voice was steady, though she could feel the tension building within her. "Please move out of the way," she said calmly, but firmly. "This is inappropriate. And I have to get home." The firefighters paused. And for a moment, it seemed like they might listen. But the silence didn't last long. The one who had spoken first, the biggest of them, with a smug grin, stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't know who we are, do you?" he said. "Maybe you should have a drink with us sometime. Let us show you what we can do." They all laughed. The sound made her skin crawl, and for the briefest moment, she wondered if she was truly in danger. But she didn't panic. She didn't give them that satisfaction. She wasn't some helpless victim to their cruelty. However, just as she began to shift the car into gear to leave, one of the firefighters, Jake, as he was later identified, pulled out a fire hose and aimed it directly at her. Before she could react, the cold water slammed into her with full force, knocking her back in her seat. The spray of water relentless. The pressure of the water made her head spin, and before she could regain her bearings, she was drenched, the water flooding her clothes. her shoes, her hair. The car, now a blur of water and chaos, was shaking under the impact. She tried to steady herself, but the onslaught of the cold water was too strong. The fire hose kept spraying, and the humiliation hit her in waves, each one more intense than the last. She could barely catch her breath as she struggled to hold onto the wheel, fighting against the grip of the water. The firefighters were laughing. The sound of it echoed in her ears as her heart pounded in her chest. She was no longer just a woman in a car, she was a target, an object of their amusement. And with each passing second, the situation spiraled further from control. The car was now shaking uncontrollably, water pouring over her, and Sophia felt something deep inside of her snap. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them take her dignity, even if they had already stolen a part of her peace. But the water kept coming, cold, relentless. And then, it stopped. And she thought, for a moment, that it was over. But as she glanced up, gasping for air, she saw their faces smiling, proud of themselves. They had won. In their minds. But not for long. Sophia was still dazed, her skin tingling from the cold water that now clung to her like a heavy, wet cloak. Her heart was racing, her mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. For a moment, she thought she might lose her grip on reality, but she steadied herself. She had to remain calm, to think clearly. She had to get out of this mess. And quickly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fumbled for the keys in the ignition. She had to move. Had to escape this humiliation before it deepened any further. But just as she tried to turn the key, the firefighters didn't let up. They continued to stand there, laughing among themselves, seemingly oblivious to the deep discomfort and distress they were causing. They stood tall and proud, like conquerors who had claimed a victory over her dignity, her composure, and her sense of security. Then, through the haze of her own thoughts, she heard the sound of a car engine approaching. It was familiar. A rumble she knew well. The unmistakable hum of Governor Mark Reynolds' car. Mark, her husband, had always been a man of strength, of principle. As the governor of Texas, he was a public figure, someone who had faced public scrutiny, but he was also someone who believed deeply in justice, fairness, and protecting those who could not protect themselves. He had always been her rock. Her mind screamed in relief. He was here. He would stop this. She didn't need to explain anything to him, he would know. He would understand. And everything would be okay. The familiar vehicle came into view. And in the split second that Sophia recognized it, the firefighters saw it too. They paused. Momentarily. Before one of them, the one who had initially sprayed her with the fire hose, waved his hand dismissively. "Look who it is," he mocked. Loud enough for Mark to hear. The big shot himself. "What's the governor going to do now? Huh? Think he can stop us?" Mark's car pulled up alongside Sophia's. And he stepped out. A commanding presence as always. The firefighters didn't even flinch when they saw him approach. And that was when Sophia's blood ran cold. They weren't intimidated. They didn't care who he was. "Sophia," Mark called out, his voice carrying a mix of concern and anger. "Are you okay? What the hell is going on here?" She could barely speak. She shook her head, still disoriented, and struggled to maintain composure. They sprayed me with a hose. I don't know why." Mark's eyes flickered with recognition. But before he could say anything else, one of the firefighters stepped forward, his grin widening. Well, the man sneered. "If it isn't the governor himself, what are you going to do? Get us fired? Try to arrest us?" Mark stood firm, his posture straight and unwavering. But he could feel the simmering anger inside him rising. This wasn't just an insult to Sophia. It was an insult to him, to his position, and to the very ideals he stood for. He was the governor, the protector of the people. Yet here he was, powerless to stop these men from mocking him, from mocking his wife. "I'm the governor of this state," Mark said, his voice cold, controlled. "And I'm telling you, stop what you're doing. Now." The firefighters just laughed. "You really think you can tell us what to do?" Jake, the one who had sprayed Sophia, spat. "We're just having some fun. This woman doesn't belong here. And neither do you." Mark's eyes narrowed, the weight of his authority now fully in place. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You will stop this. Right now." The firefighters exchanged glances. And then, as if on cue, they raised the hose again, this time aiming it directly at Mark. The water blasted him with the same force that had hit Sophia, soaking him instantly, drenching him in a humiliating show of dominance. Sophia's heart sank as she watched her husband stagger backward, the cold water hitting him in waves. She wanted to scream, to run to his side, but she couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, her legs paralyzed by the cruel spectacle unfolding before her eyes. She watched Mark, normally the strong one, now reduced to a man who was soaked, humiliated, and helpless before the very people he was supposed to protect. She could see the anger in his eyes, the disbelief and shame, but she also saw something else. A fire. A resolve that was beginning to burn deep inside him. This wasn't over. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. For the first time that night, the laughter from the firefighters faltered. They weren't used to someone standing up to them like this. They didn't expect the governor to challenge them. But Mark didn't back down. He stood there, drenched, but unbroken, his eyes fixed on the group of men who had dared to humiliate him in front of his wife. "We're not going anywhere," one of the firefighters said, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't stop us. We've got all the power here." Mark's jaw clenched, but his voice didn't waver. "You're about to lose it all." And in that moment, Sophia knew. This was just the beginning. What started as a humiliating prank had now escalated into something much darker. And she wasn't going to let it go. Neither was Mark. The cold water continued to pour over them, soaking Mark and Sophia to the bone. The firefighters, emboldened by their earlier success, seemed to take perverse delight in the humiliation. It was as though the more they sprayed, the more power they felt. But as the stream of water rained down on them, something shifted inside both Mark and Sophia. Sophia, though still reeling from the shock of what had happened, felt a spark of something, defiance. It was a quiet, seething fire in her chest, building slowly but steadily. They had underestimated her, had thought her weak, passive. But she wasn't going to take this lying down. Not now. Not ever again. Mark, drenched and shaking, was no stranger to adversity. He had fought political battles, faced public scrutiny, and stood up for the vulnerable. But this was different. This was personal. This wasn't just a matter of political power or public image. This was about his wife, his dignity, and their right to walk down the street without fear or humiliation. He wiped water from his eyes and stepped forward, his gaze locking with the firefighter who had been the ringleader. "You think this is over?" Mark's voice was low, steady, yet the edge of fury was clear. "You think you can do whatever you want because you wear a uniform? You're wrong." The firefighter, still holding the hose, chuckled darkly. "You've got nothing, Governor. You and your wife are nobody, just two people who think they can stop us. But you can't. You're just as weak as anyone else." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had seen the cruelty in their eyes. And now she saw it for what it was, weakness masquerading as strength. These men weren't powerful. They were bullies. Pathetic and sadistic, hiding behind the very institution they had sworn to serve. Without thinking, she took a step forward, locking eyes with Mark. He met her gaze. And for a brief moment, everything else faded. It was just the two of them standing together, their resolve solidifying. They had been humiliated, yes, but they would not allow it to break them. Then, with a quick motion, Mark lunged toward the hose, grabbing it with both hands. The firefighter holding it tried to pull away, but Mark was stronger, more determined now than ever before. He twisted the nozzle, and the water stopped flowing. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. The firefighters, caught off guard, seemed to realize that their control was slipping. Mark stood tall, his shoulders square, his eyes blazing with a fire that wasn't just about anger, it was about justice. About making them pay for what they had done. Sophia took a step closer, her hand gently resting on Mark's arm. "We're not going to let them get away with this," she said quietly. Mark turned to her, his face wet but resolute. "No, we're not. But we need to make sure they understand that. All of them." The firefighters exchanged uncomfortable glances. The once confident leader now seemed hesitant, realizing that their game was over. They weren't dealing with a politician who would cower under pressure. They were facing a man and a woman who had just been pushed beyond their breaking point. And now they were going to make sure that everyone knew what had happened. "What happens now?" one of the firefighters asked, his voice suddenly lacking the earlier bravado. Mark didn't answer right away. He just stared at them, his mind working. He knew what needed to be done. They would report this, publicly, loud and clear. It would not be swept under the rug. The video footage that had been recorded by a passerby would ensure that the world saw the truth. "We're going to the police," Mark finally said, his voice firm. "And you'll be held accountable for every drop of water you sprayed on us. Every insult you threw our way." As the firefighters stood there in stunned silence, Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Dialing the police. She didn't hesitate. She spoke with authority, telling them exactly what had happened, describing the men who had attacked them, and stating that they were on their way to the station. Her heart raced, but her resolve remained unshaken. This was no longer just about the immediate incident. It was about making sure that this never happened to anyone else again. Mark stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, offering silent support. They had been humiliated, yes, but now they were taking control of the situation. They weren't going to run from it, weren't going to let it consume them. They were going to stand tall, and they were going to make sure that the people who had wronged them would face the consequences. The air was thick with tension as Mark and Sophia made their way toward the police station. The adrenaline had not yet worn off, and each step felt heavier than the last. Sophia's mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. But it all felt surreal, as though this cruelty had taken place in another world, not the one she had once known. As they walked, they passed people who seemed to recognize them. They looked on in shock, some whispering under their breath, others taking out their phones, documenting the scene. It was like they were trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The public reaction was immediate, but it didn't feel like enough. Not yet. Sophia's body was aching from the cold water, her muscles stiffening with each movement. But there was something else, a deep sense of humiliation that gnawed at her. Something she could feel deep inside. Despite her outward composure, she and Mark had been treated like they were nothing, like their very presence was an inconvenience. And that feeling cut deeper than any physical wound. She glanced at her husband. His face was drawn, his clothes heavy with water, but his eyes burned with something that wasn't just anger. It was determination. They had been humiliated, yes, but they were far from broken. And as they approached the police station, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. The closer they got to the officers, the more it hit home. This wasn't just a personal assault. This was an attack on their dignity, their sense of safety. It was a violation of everything they stood for. And yet, there was still a sense of resolve. A promise they had made to each other. They were going to take this to the end. No matter what. When they entered the station, The officers immediately took notice of their disheveled, water-soaked appearance. A few glanced at each other in concern. But there was no immediate rush to act. They had seen their share of strange cases. Of citizens who came in bruised, battered, and broken. But nothing like this. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't just another case of assault. This was something different. A young officer approached them, his face full of concern as he took their details and listened to their account of the events. It didn't take long before the video footage, which had circulated like wildfire, was brought into view. The whole world seemed to be watching now, and as the police watched the footage, their faces hardened. Mark and Sophia exchanged a glance. There was something unspoken between them. A shared understanding that the road ahead would be difficult. That this would take time, effort, and energy they didn't know if they had. But at that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just the firefighters who had power. The truth had power, and they were determined to let it be known. Everything's recorded, the officer said. After watching the footage, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Those men won't be able to hide behind their badges. Sophia took a deep breath, the knot in her stomach loosening just slightly. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. This was the beginning of something bigger than just their personal nightmare. They were going to make sure that this wouldn't happen to anyone else. That the abusers would be held accountable. Mark squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We won't stop, he said softly. This is just the first step. And we'll keep moving forward. But even as they left the station, knowing that the wheels of justice were beginning to turn, there was a part of them that knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. The firefighters who had attacked them weren't just faceless criminals. They were people who had once been respected in their community. People with power. And power, as they both knew too well, could be a double-edged sword. It could be used for good or to silence those who spoke up. They would need allies. They would need more than just the police. They would need the public, the media, the citizens who stood for what was right. As they walked out into the cold, their resolve had hardened. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed around, dismissed, or abused. The fight had only just begun, and they were ready. As Mark and Sophia made their way down the street, the chilly evening air nipped at their skin, but it couldn't cool the fire that had ignited inside them. Every step felt more purposeful than the last. The weight of the situation was still heavy, but with every passing moment, they became more certain that they were not walking this path alone. The whole world seemed to be waking up to their story. The footage of the attack had spread like wildfire, igniting conversations across social media, in newsrooms, and on the streets. Sophia's mind was racing as she tried to process it all. She had never imagined her life would take such a turn. She had always been a private person, focused on her family, her work, and her community. But now, she was the face of something much bigger. She was no longer just a wife or a victim, she was a symbol. And while the weight of that was overwhelming, it also gave her a newfound sense of purpose. As they walked, their footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, the only sound in the otherwise quiet street. But then, a voice broke the silence. "Are you okay?" A woman's voice called out from behind them. Mark and Sophia turned to find a woman approaching them, her face full of concern. She was in her 30s, with dark brown hair and soft, compassionate eyes. There was something about her, something sincere, that made Sophia feel, for a moment, like everything might be okay. "We saw the footage," the woman continued, walking up to them. I wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened. It's not right. It shouldn't have happened." Sophia blinked, surprised by the woman's kindness. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the woman replied with a small smile. "I just wanted to let you know that people are watching. And we're with you. There are more of us than you think. We're all tired of seeing people in power get away with things like this. Mark gave the woman a thankful nod, his expression softening for the first time in hours. Thank you. That means a lot, he said, his voice quieter now, like the weight of the situation had momentarily lifted. The woman, whose name was Emily, offered her phone. Do you need help getting in touch with someone? Or maybe getting the message out more? There are groups organizing protests, petitions. This is bigger than just one incident. Sophia felt a swell of emotion rising inside her. It was overwhelming. This outpouring of support. This realization that they were not alone. Her initial feelings of isolation, of being just one small voice, were slowly melting away. Now, her voice was part of something much larger. We'll be okay, Mark said, as he glanced at Sophia. We have to be. We owe it to everyone who's ever been mistreated to see this through. Emily smiled and handed them a card with information about a group of local activists who were already working on building awareness for the case. There are people who want to help, and they'll make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug. You're not alone in this. With that, Emily walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But her words remained, like a small beacon of light in a sea of uncertainty. As Mark and Sophia continued on their way, they passed more people who stopped to offer words of encouragement. Some hugged them. Others gave them quiet nods of solidarity. It was as if the city itself was waking up to what had happened. There was an energy now, an undercurrent of support, that Sophia hadn't felt before. She glanced at Mark, her heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't just the kindness of strangers. It was the way he had stood beside her through everything. Even in the face of humiliation, he hadn't wavered. He hadn't backed down. Together, they were stronger. And they weren't backing down now. Let's keep going, Mark said, his voice firm. Let's make sure this counts. For us. For everyone. Sophia nodded, taking his hand with a renewed sense of determination. The journey ahead would be long, but they had found their resolve. It wasn't just about seeking justice anymore. It was about changing the system. About proving that people in power could not hide behind their badges, their positions, or their authority. They were going to make sure that the voices of the powerless were heard. The days following the incident felt like a blur. But amidst the chaos, something shifted. For the first time since the attack, Sophia and Mark felt the weight of what had happened begin to turn into momentum. It wasn't just the raw emotion of the assault anymore, it was the sense that something bigger was beginning to take shape. Their ordeal had resonated with people far beyond their immediate circle, and that collective outrage was beginning to manifest into action. It was early one afternoon when they were approached by two police officers while they were walking in the park, speaking quietly but with urgency about their next steps. The officers had been briefed on the situation and, to their surprise, were just as disheartened by the attack as the general public. We've been following the news, Officer Adams said, a tall man with dark, steady eyes. And we want you to know that we're taking this seriously. We're gathering statements from all those involved. The footage has already made it to our department. And it's clear we have a serious case here. Mark felt his chest tighten as he heard those words. It wasn't just the shock of reliving the moment but the relief that something was finally happening. He'd been worried that this would be dismissed, that the power dynamics would protect the firefighters, that his position as governor would offer little against the sheer force of public indifference. Sophia, too, felt a flicker of hope. She had braced herself for more empty promises from the system, more polite gestures that would ultimately lead nowhere, but now, there was a tangible sense of accountability in the air. We need to get your statement, Officer Stevens added, his voice soft but serious. The sooner we can piece everything together, the sooner we can make sure those responsible face consequences. This kind of abuse of power can't go unchallenged. The officers took their time listening to their accounts, making sure to note every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. It wasn't just about recording their words. It was about validating their pain, their experience, and most importantly, their dignity. As the conversation went on, the officer's assurances began to sink in, replacing the feeling of helplessness that had clouded Sophia's thoughts for so long. She had been an unwilling witness to her own humiliation, unsure of how to fight back against men who were so firmly entrenched in their position of power. But now, she had a voice, and that voice was being heard. Once the statements were taken, Officer Adams spoke again. "We'll begin the investigation immediately. The firefighters in question will be identified, and we will ensure they are suspended until we have a full review of the situation. We can't promise the outcome just yet, but I can assure you we're going to do everything we can to hold them accountable." The officers gave them their contact information and reassured them that they would remain in touch. As they walked away, Mark put his arm around Sophia's shoulders, pulling her closer to him. "This is it," he said quietly. "We've made a difference. They won't get away with this." Sophia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know. I just want justice. For us. For everyone who's ever been pushed down by people who think they're untouchable." The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets began to pick up the story, and the public outcry reached a fever pitch. More statements came forward. Other witnesses who had seen parts of the incident stepped forward, adding to the mounting evidence. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a part of a broader culture of abuse. The media coverage only heightened the pressure on the authorities. And soon, the investigation gained national attention. As the story spread, so did the support. The public was watching, and they were demanding action. For the first time, the system was feeling the weight of its own failures. Sophia and Mark couldn't help but feel the shift. The power dynamics that had once felt so impenetrable were beginning to crack. They were no longer facing the world alone. The truth was gathering around them, becoming a collective force that no one could ignore. They were tired. Yes. They were emotionally drained and battered by the events of the past week. But they were also emboldened. With each passing moment, they knew that they were no longer passive participants in their own lives. They were driving the change. And they weren't stopping. The morning after their meeting with the police officers, Sophia and Mark woke up to a different world. It felt as though their ordeal had shifted from being an isolated trauma to a national conversation, one that was unfolding with dizzying speed and intensity. News reports had flooded in, with images from the footage playing on every television screen. The rawness of the moment, the cold water, the laughter, the cruelty, had become the face of the story. And now, the police were moving quickly. It was a Thursday when they received the call. Officer Adams's voice was clear but filled with urgency. "We've identified the firefighters involved," he said, "and we're bringing them in for questioning today. We're also issuing a suspension until we have a full review of the incident." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly believe it after all the uncertainty, all the fears that nothing would be done. This felt like a real step. A step toward something that could finally right the wrong that had been done to them. "I'm just glad you're taking this seriously," Mark said quietly, squeezing Sophia's hand as they sat together in their living room. "We've been asking for accountability. And now it's happening." Sophia's eyes were still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, a growing belief that justice might be more than a distant ideal. Later that afternoon, the couple attended a meeting at the police station, where they were briefed on the next steps. Officer Stevens, along with Officer Adams, walked them through the progress of the investigation. "The footage we've gathered is compelling," Officer Stevens said, pointing to the screen in front of them. "We've identified at least 3 of the firefighters who were directly involved. They will be brought in for questioning. And from there, we'll determine the charges." The weight of those words settled heavily between them. It wasn't just about identifying the perpetrators, it was about holding them to account. For the first time, They could feel the system working in their favor. The weight of the law bearing down on the men who had caused so much harm. But even with this progress, Sophia still couldn't help but feel the ghost of doubt lingering in her chest. She wasn't naive. She knew that power had a way of protecting itself. That even in the face of overwhelming evidence, there were still ways for people to escape justice. The fire department was well connected. These men had been part of the system for years. Trusted figures in the community. They would not go down without a fight. "What happens now?" Mark asked. His voice steady but with a touch of uncertainty. "We'll move forward with the charges. But we'll need your continued cooperation." Officer Adams explained. "We'll also need to conduct a thorough review of the fire department's practices, including sensitivity training and oversight. This cannot just be a case where we punish the individuals, we need to look at the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." Sophia nodded. She had seen enough of this world to know that accountability needed to extend beyond individual cases, it had to involve systemic change. It wasn't enough for the firefighters to be held responsible. There needed to be a deeper reckoning. The culture that allowed them to abuse their power needed to be dismantled. As they left the station that day, Mark looked at her with a quiet sense of pride. "We're doing this. We're actually doing this." Sophia took his hand. The weight of everything still pressing against her but tempered by the steady force of their shared resolve. "We are. But it's only just begun." The couple felt an unexpected sense of clarity in that moment. They weren't victims anymore. They were warriors in a fight for something greater than themselves. It wasn't just about the humiliation they had endured, it was about setting a precedent for others. About making sure that no one else would have to endure what they had. And, as the investigation unfolded and the pressure on the fire department grew, they could see the first rays of a broader change beginning to take shape. Sophia knew that this battle was far from over. But with each step, it felt like they were carving a new path, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a living, breathing force. And this time, it was unstoppable. By the time Sophia and Mark arrived at the press conference, the world felt different. They had never expected to find themselves at the center of such a firestorm. Yet here they were, standing in front of microphones, surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing, as they prepared to speak out about the horrors they had endured. The firestorm that had begun with a single act of cruelty had snowballed into something much bigger, a movement for accountability, transparency, and justice. The conference was being held at the state capitol. Mark, as governor, had been under tremendous pressure to act swiftly and decisively. The public demanded answers. The press was relentless. But more than anything, people were watching. The story had resonated far beyond the confines of their small town. Every corner of the nation had been captivated by the video footage. The sight of the firefighters' brutality, and the story of a family fighting for what was right. Sophia could feel the eyes of the world on her. She had never liked the spotlight, never enjoyed being the focus of attention. But this was different. This wasn't about fame or personal gain, it was about the truth. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, and making sure that the same thing never happened again. This was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the sanctity of the public trust. Mark stepped up to the podium, his face calm but his eyes burning with the same quiet fury that had propelled him throughout this ordeal. The audience grew still as he began to speak, his voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you all for being here," he started, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Today, we stand not just for ourselves, but for every citizen who has ever been mistreated or ignored by those in positions of power. This is a moment of reckoning. Not just for the individuals responsible for the actions we've witnessed, but for the culture that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked." Sophia stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to remind herself that this was not about reliving the pain they had suffered, it was about giving a voice to the truth. She stepped forward. Her turn to speak had arrived. She cleared her throat, her words steady but filled with emotion. We will not allow this injustice to be swept under the rug, she said, her voice carrying across the room. What happened to us was not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger problem. One that exists in institutions across this country, where those entrusted with the public's safety and well-being abuse their power and act without accountability. It is time for change. Her words echoed in the chamber, reverberating with the weight of truth. The crowd fell silent, some nodding in agreement, others still processing the force of what had just been said. The media was recording every word, every moment. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. This was a conversation that was happening nationwide. Mark stepped back up to the microphone, his voice strong. We demand that the fire department undergo a full review of its practices. We call for mandatory sensitivity and accountability training for all public service workers. We must ensure that those who serve the public do so with honor, respect, and responsibility. It's time for the system to change. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just a political statement, it was a rallying cry. The couple wasn't just speaking for themselves, they were speaking for every person who had ever been silenced or ignored by a system that favored the powerful. Sophia's eyes burned with unshed tears as she looked out at the crowd. For the first time since the incident, she felt a surge of hope. This fight was bigger than they had realized. It was about setting a precedent for what kind of society they wanted to live in, a society that valued dignity, respect, and justice above all else. As the press conference continued, more questions came, more details were revealed. But the message was clear. The fight for justice had only just begun. And now, with the support of the public, the weight of the media, and the backing of law enforcement, they were not just survivors, they were agents of change. Sophia knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, challenges, and resistance. But as they left the conference room, she felt a sense of peace. They were not fighting this battle alone. They had a cause now. A cause that was larger than the pain they had endured. It was a cause that would ripple outward, touching the lives of others who had been silenced for far too long. And in that moment, Sophia realized something profound. The power of speaking out wasn't just in the words you said, but in the courage it took to say them, even when the world was watching. The aftermath of the press conference was a whirlwind of media coverage, public discourse, and legal action. Mark and Sophia had ignited a spark, and it spread like wildfire across the country. The message they had shared, the pain they had expressed, and the demand for accountability had resonated far beyond their expectations. What had once been a personal struggle was now a nationwide conversation about justice, integrity, and the responsibility of those in power. In the days that followed, the police launched an official investigation into the firefighters involved in the assault. Evidence was gathered, including the footage recorded by the passerby, and witnesses were interviewed. It was clear from the outset that the firefighters' actions had been both deliberate and cruel, and the investigation quickly revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior within the department. The pressure from the public, amplified by the media coverage and the governor's vocal stance, was impossible to ignore. Sophia and Mark remained at the forefront of the case, offering statements, cooperating with law enforcement, and making sure their voices were heard. Their commitment to justice never wavered, even as the weight of the situation began to take its toll. The stress of the public scrutiny, the emotional toll of reliving the trauma, and the constant scrutiny from both the media and their political adversaries weighed heavily on them. Yet, they knew they had no choice but to continue. Their fight was no longer just for their own dignity, it was for a system that needed reform. For every individual who had been mistreated by those meant to protect them. As the investigation progressed, the fire department was forced to address the allegations in a public forum. An internal review was launched, and the department's leadership began to acknowledge the deep flaws within their culture. For the first time, they publicly admitted that their training and oversight had failed, and they pledged to take immediate action to prevent future abuses. For Sophia and Mark, this was both a victory and a bittersweet reminder of the injustices they had faced. The public acknowledgement of the fire department's shortcomings was a step in the right direction. But it did little to erase the harm done. They were determined to see real change, not just empty promises. Legal action was taken against the firefighters involved, and they were quickly placed on leave pending further investigation. The case gained momentum as more and more people rallied behind the couple, their voices joining in the call for justice. The local court began to prepare for hearings, and there was a growing sense of anticipation. Would the firefighters be held accountable for their actions? Would this mark the beginning of systemic change? But Sophia and Mark knew that the legal process was only part of the journey. They wanted something more than just the punishment of the individuals responsible. They wanted lasting reform. They wanted a world where public servants were held to higher standards, where those in power were trained not just to serve, but to empathize, to listen, and to respect the people they were meant to protect. In the weeks that followed, they worked tirelessly with lawmakers to draft new policies that would require sensitivity and accountability training for all public service workers. They lobbied for the creation of independent oversight bodies that could investigate complaints of abuse, ensuring that there would be a mechanism for holding individuals accountable in real time. They pushed for the establishment of public forums where citizens could express their concerns, and for the implementation of comprehensive reviews of all public service departments. Mark's position as governor gave him a platform to champion these reforms, and he used it relentlessly. But it was Sophia's passion, her personal experience, that gave the movement its heart. Together, they were able to push through legislation that would change the way public service workers were trained and held accountable. Their advocacy led to the creation of a statewide initiative for police and fire department reform, which would serve as a model for other states to follow. The day the bill passed through the state legislature was one of the proudest moments of their lives. They had faced immense challenges, from personal pain to political opposition. But they had not given up. The reforms they had fought for were not just symbolic, they were tangible, lasting changes that would affect generations to come. As they stood together on the steps of the State House, surrounded by supporters and activists, Mark and Sophia shared a quiet moment. They had achieved something monumental, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered under a broken system. They had taken their pain and transformed it into something powerful, a movement that would reshape the future. Sophia knew that the fight was far from over, but she also knew that real change had begun. And in that moment, she realized that justice was not just about holding others accountable, it was about creating a future where such injustices could no longer happen in the first place. The final chapter of Mark and Sophia's journey is not just one of justice served, but of lessons learned, both for them and for the world around them, as they reflect on everything that transpired, on the pain, the fight, and the triumphs. They each draw their own profound conclusions, shaping the future they now fight to build. For Sophia, the journey had been a path of resilience and empathy. She had gone from a place of shock and disbelief to one of clarity and determination. The brutal assault by the firefighters, which had once felt like a personal nightmare, had revealed something much larger: the systemic abuses that often go unnoticed, the unseen scars that people carry in silence, and the unspoken responsibility each of us has in protecting the vulnerable. But in the midst of it all, Sophia had also learned about the importance of compassion for both herself and others. She understood now that while it was crucial to hold people accountable, it was equally vital to understand the trauma behind the actions, the deep-rooted issues that shaped such behavior. The fire department's problems had not emerged in isolation, they had been born of a culture of neglect, a disregard for emotional intelligence, and a lack of meaningful training. Her lesson, then, was twofold: justice is not simply about punishment, but about healing. Sophia knew that real justice was achieved when people not only paid for their wrongdoings but were given the opportunity to understand and correct them. She would continue to advocate for systemic change, But she would also carry with her the lesson of forgiveness, not as an excuse, but as a way to break the cycles of hatred and cruelty that too often perpetuate violence. Sophia's parting reflection was simple: we cannot change the past, but we can shape the future through empathy and action. For Mark, the entire ordeal had been a profound exercise in humility. As governor, he had been accustomed to commanding authority, to wielding power, to being the one who enacted change. But in this battle, he had been reminded that power, by itself, was not enough. True leadership required not only authority but integrity, something that transcended the titles and the privileges that came with the office. Mark had seen firsthand the limits of institutional power, how even those in positions of authority could be indifferent or even callous to the suffering of others. What the firefighters had done to his wife was a manifestation of something far deeper: a sense of entitlement, a lack of accountability, and a failure to see others as equals deserving of dignity and respect. The experience had shaken him, but it had also clarified the nature of leadership. The key lesson Mark drew from the experience was the understanding that true leadership lies in humility and service. No matter how high one climbs, leadership should never be about dominating others, it should be about lifting them up. He recognized that those in power, whether in government, the police, or the fire department, had a moral obligation to serve their communities with empathy and respect. His newfound passion for reform wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers, but about rebuilding a system that would never allow such atrocities to happen again. Mark's closing thought was this: leadership is not about being in control, but about being responsible for the lives entrusted to you. The people who had rallied behind Sophia and Mark also had their own lessons to learn. The public outcry, the protests, the support from everyday citizens, it was a testament to the power of collective action, to the way a community could come together when faced with injustice. But as the story unfolded, the real lesson for the public was about accountability, not just for public servants, but for themselves as well. The incident had been an awakening. It had revealed how easily society could turn a blind eye to wrongdoing when it wasn't directly affecting them. It showed how people could justify indifference, either out of fear or ignorance, when the wrongs of others seemed too distant. But when Mark and Sophia's story went viral, when the injustice became undeniable, people realized that standing up for others was not a luxury, it was a responsibility. The public's lesson was about the power of unity. Their voices had been part of the larger movement, pushing for reform, demanding change, and ensuring that the injustices of the past would not be repeated. They had shown that even ordinary citizens could make a difference, that by speaking up and standing together, they could force change and hold the powerful accountable. Their lesson: when we stand united, even the most entrenched systems of power can be transformed. As the months passed, the reforms that Mark and Sophia had fought for began to take shape. Public service workers were now required to undergo rigorous training on empathy, accountability, and community engagement. New oversight mechanisms were put in place, ensuring that those who wore the badge would be held to a higher standard. It was only the beginning, but the ripple effects of their work were felt across the country. Sophia and Mark had achieved what they set out to do, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. They had been through hell and back, but in the end, they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to continue the fight for a more just and compassionate world. They had learned that the true measure of success was not in the victory itself, but in the lasting impact of the changes that followed. And that, perhaps, was the most profound lesson of all, in the pursuit of justice. The end is never truly an end. It is merely a beginning of a new chapter where compassion, humility, and action will guide the way forward. This was the legacy Mark and Sophia had left behind, not just the reforms or the new policies, but the example they had set for future generations. An example that would remind everyone that change is possible, no matter how daunting the journey may seem. And so, As they looked out at the horizon, they knew their story was far from over. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one in which justice, empathy, and accountability would forever be the guiding principles.